Welcome back to Hinduism. This video is the last in the series, and it surveys the history of Hinduism from around 1800 to the present. In the 15th century, the Portuguese began to explore routes to sail to India directly. The trade with India in spices was valued very highly by Europeans. Spices such as cinnamon, cloves, pepper, and turmeric were popular for European cuisine, but they were very expensive. They were imported by Venetians from Italy to the rest of Europe. And the Venetians had to trade with a bunch of other intermediaries, such as Turkish or Arab merchants in the Middle East. So the spices were very costly. The King of Portugal realized that if he could sail directly to India and buy spices there, that would be very profitable. The Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama sailed with the support of the king from Portugal to India in 1497 by traveling south around the Cape of Africa. After this time, there was a steady stream of Portuguese merchants trading with India, and the kingdom profited greatly. They also established colonies and trading posts in India, mainly on port cities that they were using as hubs or depots for their trade. The Portuguese brought with them Catholic priests who wanted to convert the Indians to Christianity. And this went on from around the 15th to the 18th centuries. An example of a former Portuguese colony is Goa, the city of Goa on the west coast of India. And there are still many Catholics there today. There are other populations of Catholics in India, especially in South India, such as the state of Tamil Nadu. Because Portugal had profited so much from the spice trade with India, many other European countries wanted to get involved. This map shows some of the colonies and trading posts established by various European nations in India from the 15th to the 18th centuries. The main players, apart from Portugal, were England, France, and the Netherlands. Eventually, these powers started to compete with each other for supremacy. This was to some extent a global conflict. For example, the English and French fought each other not only in Europe, but also in their colonies around the world, including in North America. Eventually, the English, or the United Kingdom, was predominant in India, so they became the main colonial power. There were still some other European colonies there, but they tended to be few and not very powerful. As the British consolidated their control over India, they started to get involved in the local politics of Indian kingdoms. These European colonies have been founded during the years of the Mughal Empire, which was a very powerful Muslim dynasty with its capital in Delhi in North India. However, the Mughals gradually declined through this period, and the Europeans, especially the British, became more entwined with the politics of Indian kingdoms. And eventually, they were able to take control of all of India. British East India is the general name for India when it was ruled by the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. At first, the British ruled India through a private company called the British East India Company. This lasted from 1757 to 1858. The British East India Company had existed for a while, and they were given a monopoly on trade between India and the United Kingdom. So it was a very profitable company. However, in 1857, there was an event known as the Sepoy Mutiny, or the Indian Rebellion, as it's usually referred to nowadays. The Sepoy Mutiny was when certain troops, soldiers who were serving the British East India Company, called sepoys, rebelled against the company. And this rebellion did spread. Eventually, the British East India Company was able to suppress it including with the help of some other Indian soldiers that were working for them. Modern Indians tend to regard this as a nationalistic rebellion or attempted revolution against the British. And indeed, there may have been elements of that, because by this year, 1857, the idea of Indian home rule or independence from Britain had started to become more popular. After this event, the British government took direct control of India. They basically abolished the British East India Company. The period of British direct rule is called the British Raj. It lasted from 1858 to 1947. And the various British territories in India were called the British East India Empire. You can see a map of that on the right. Under British rule, there were some Protestant Christian missionaries who traveled to India to convert people to Christianity. Protestant Christianity is the type that broke off from the Catholic Christian Church in the early 16th century. There were several different Protestant churches in Britain. The established church was the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, but there were also denominations such as Presbyterians and Methodists. And the missionaries did have some success in converting Indians, mainly in Bengal, which is in northeast India. However, most Indians remain Hindu or Muslim or whatever their previous religion was. During British rule, there was a controversy over a practice known as sati. Sati is a custom in which a Hindu widow leaps onto her husband's funeral pyre as an act of self-sacrifice and a demonstration of her devotion to her husband. Sati has always been very rare. It's not clear if it was ever really a widespread custom, but according to the historical records, there were hundreds of cases of it, mainly in North India during the British rule. At first they tolerated it, but eventually there was outrage about it, so they banned the practice in 1829. It was around this time that Hindus and other Indians really started to gain a sense of their own identity and began to organize for Indian independence from Britain. An example of a Hindu reform movement is the Brahmins Summage. This was a movement to attempt to revive but also reform Hinduism. In the early 19th century, there began to be a kind of collective cultural movement to strengthen Hinduism against its potential encroachment by the British or by Christianity, but also to modernize it in various ways. The Brahmins Summage was perhaps the most radical of the reforms, as well as being the first one. It was founded by Ram Mohan Roy, and the Brahmins Summage is named after Brahman. They were monotheistic. They believed in only one supreme God, so they did not worship other gods of the Veda or other Hindu gods, such as Shiva or Lakshmi or Ganesha and so on. The Brahmins Samaj also reject the Veda, which was quite radical, and rejecting the doctrines of avatars or incarnations of the gods. They didn't use idols or murtis, and they also rejected the caste system. This is surprising because Hinduism is basically defined by the Veda and by the Brahmin caste. However, they were taking a sort of rationalized approach to Hindu philosophy and theology based on Brahman, especially what you can find in the Vedanta and the Upanishads and certain parts of the Veda that talk about Brahman. Also, even though Ram Mohan Roy seemed to have been giving a philosophical reinterpretation of the Upanishads, he taught that belief in karma and rebirth and samsara is optional. He didn't require it for his followers. Ram Mohan Roy also opposed the practice of sati and child marriage. Once again, it must be emphasized that sati was never a very common practice, but the fact that it happened at all was upsetting to some reformers. The main influence on the Brahmins Summage seems to have been the European Enlightenment. So Ram Mohan Roy did learn about English and European culture. He had a somewhat European education. He created a rational or rationalized approach to religion. The Enlightenment was a movement in Europe, especially in the 18th century, which sought to reform religion, politics, and society based on reason and science. So an example of the religious aspect of the Enlightenment is deism. Deism is the belief that there is a God who created the universe and set up the natural laws that govern it. But then God does not interfere with the universe and its laws after he created them. So deism tends to deny miracles, which are violations of natural law. This European Enlightenment had also influenced figures in the United States, such as Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Many of them also tended to be deists in their approach to religion. So you can look at the Brahmins Summage as an attempt to rationalize Hinduism along these Enlightenment and deist lines. It doesn't really exist to this day, but Ram Mohan Roy is still regarded as a sort of cultural hero by a lot of Hindus. Another important reform movement of the 19th century was the Arya Samaj. Arya Samaj means the noble assembly, whereas Brahmo Samaj means the assembly of Brahman or the supreme. The Arya Samaj dates to 1875 and after. It was founded by Dayananda Saraswati. He was an early advocate of Hindavi Swarajya, or Indian self-rule. He also taught a religion based purely on the Veda, or his concept of a purified Vedic religion. So he does not allow using idols or images, and followers of the Arya Samaj practice certain Vedic rituals like having a fire altar and giving an offering of milk to the gods, or really to God. Even though Dayananda Saraswati portrayed himself as restoring the purity of the Vedas, this assembly was a monotheistic movement. They believed in only one supreme God, and they used Om as the name of God. So Dayananda Saraswati also believed that all castes of Hindus should study the Veda, not just Brahmins. It's a religion based on the early Veda, the Samhita, but it doesn't privilege the Brahmin caste as much as traditional Vedic religion had. He founded a bunch of Vedic schools where Hindus of many castes could go to study the Veda, and this was an innovation, perhaps influenced by the Christian schools that had been set up by the British during this period. He also was unique in that he sought converts among Muslims and Christians to Hinduism. This was something that had never really been a part of Hindu practice before, proselytizing to non-believers. So many of these features of the Arya Samaj show the influence of the Protestant Christianity that had been brought to India by the British. Some examples are the proselytizing, seeking converts, and the monotheism. Another aspect of this Protestant Christian influence is what is called sola scriptura in Protestant Christianity. That means solely or only the scriptures. Many Protestants try to base all of their beliefs just on a reading of the Bible, and they think that other religious traditions that don't have a basis in the Bible are not an authentic part of Christianity. Similarly, Dayananda Saraswati based his religion on the Veda specifically. Also, the fact that Protestant Christianity doesn't believe in using icons or images. This was probably an influence both on the Brahmo Samaj and on the Arya Samaj in their rejection of murtis. Another aspect of Protestant Christianity that may have influenced Dayananda Saraswati is the notion of the priesthood of all believers. Going back to Martin Luther and other early Protestant reformers, they thought that there was no natural or essential hierarchy between clergy and other members of the faith. So they rejected the Catholic Church's privileged status given to priests, because only priests can act as people who perform the Mass, and they're a kind of intermediary between the believer and God. whereas the Protestants believe that all Christians should study the Bible and have a direct personal relationship with God. And that's similar to the Arya Samage's lack of emphasis on the special status of Brahmins. There is a notion that all Hindus should study the Veda directly. This movement is still around today. However, it is not as influential as it was in the 19th century. Its main historical legacy is helping to revive Hinduism and leading to an Indian Renaissance. It was in the 19th century that Hinduism also started to spread to the West, or knowledge of Hinduism and other Indian religions. An early important event was Charles Wilkins' translation of the Bhagavad Gita and other parts of the Mahabharata into English, starting in 1785. Charles Wilkins was the first European to extensively study Indian languages and religious texts. He even deciphered an ancient Indian script called Brahmi, that knowledge of which had essentially been lost to history. He also created a typeface or printable font for Devanagari script. This is the script used to write Sanskrit in modern texts. And he wrote books on the grammar and vocabulary of Sanskrit and Bengali. Bengali is a modern language derived from Sanskrit that is spoken widely in Northeast India. As a result of Charles Wilkins' work, there was a birth of scholarship in English, French, and German on Buddhism and Hinduism throughout the 19th century. So many European scholars started to study the large and complex literature of India in depth at this time. And that began to have an influence on European philosophy and the arts and so on. Another important event in the transfer of knowledge of Hinduism to the West was a philosophical and literary movement in the United States known as Transcendentalism. This occurred during the 1820s and 1830s. It was not primarily a religious movement per se. It was mainly literary and philosophical, although there were certainly religious themes in it. The core influence on Transcendentalism was German idealism. This is a series of early 19th century philosophers, mainly in Germany, that were influenced by the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant. So one of their core ideas is idealism. They had a tendency to regard mind and the structure of mind or consciousness as fundamental to all of reality. This was a kind of expansion and interpretation of some of the things taught by Kant. Kant basically believed that the mind structures the fundamental categories of reality, such as space and time. So in some sense, these categories are what he called transcendental. They are things that you cannot prove or discover through sense experience of the world. They exist in the mind's attempt to pattern and arrange the world. The German idealists took this in the direction of regarding mind itself as the primary reality. And that's a theme you see in Transcendentalism. There were similarities between this approach and the traditional Hindu philosophy of Advaita Vedanta and other aspects of Hinduism. And even though the Transcendentalists didn't extensively name or cite Hindu texts, they did have some knowledge of them, and they occasionally cite Hindu ideas in their works. The Transcendentalists also had a tendency to emphasize the unity of the cosmos, and that also made them resemble Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual approach to Hinduism. So an example of the Hindu influence is they published a translation into English of the Bhagavad Gita and other Asian religious texts in their literary journal, which was called the Dial. And this was an important method for the propagation of knowledge of Hinduism among the literary elites in the United States. So two of the most important figures in Transcendentalism were Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Emerson had been a Unitarian minister, but he left the church to write and give talks on his philosophy. Emerson has a kind of theology in which there's a sort of transcendent, uh, purely conscious God he calls the Oversoul in some passages that governs or looks over the cosmos. And this could perhaps be compared to the Advaita Vedanta view of Brahman, insofar as the Oversoul is something you can connect to directly within, and he really emphasizes the unity of all of the world, all of the creation or the emanation of this one intelligence. Henry David Thoreau was mainly a writer, and he's most famous for spending some time living alone in a hut in the forest on Walden Pond in New England, where he was from. And he kept a journal of his experiences on Walden Pond, and it became a best-selling book. There are a couple passages in this book where he talks about spending long periods in just sitting quietly and reflection. And he, in one passage, he compares this to Indian or other mystics who spend time in contemplation. And he realizes this can really mature the mind and the character. He compares it to corn ripening in the night. So he seems to have practiced a kind of informal method of meditation that was possibly influenced by some of these Hindu texts he had read about. So even more important than Transcendentalism for spreading knowledge of Hinduism to the West was a later new religion called Theosophy. Theosophy was founded in 1875 by the English mystic Henry Steele Olcott and the Russian mystic Helena Blavatsky. You can see in the picture on the right. Theosophists believe in a single esoteric or secret spiritual teaching that is behind all religions. So they essentially try to combine the mystical teachings of many religions, which tend to be about how to experience God directly, how to unite your consciousness with God, things like that. They regard that as a common core to all religions. And they combine beliefs from Western traditions, such as Hermeticism or magic, and Western mystical traditions, such as the Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism, and Neoplatonism, which is an ancient Greek philosophy that tended towards monotheism and also believed in reincarnation, and also taught how you could unite your consciousness with God, which they called the One. Neoplatonism actually influenced the later mystic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So the Theosophists are combining all of those Western traditions with beliefs from Hinduism and Buddhism. So from Hinduism, we can see they take beliefs such as karma, samsara, the belief of many gods and their avatars or incarnations, and even the belief in the cosmic cycles, similar to what you find in the Hindu Puranas and Dharmashastras. So they believe in different ages. The Theosophists also taught various types of yoga, and they were really important for introducing yoga to the West. Another influence that we can see from Hinduism on the West in the 19th century is the New Thought movement. This did not originate with direct Hindu influence. It seems to have been influenced by a mesmerist or mentalist named Phineas Quimby. Mesmerism was a theory from the early 19th century that there was a kind of magnetic energy or force in the world that could be used directly by the human mind to manipulate objects, the world, and other people. And this notion of mind over matter, as it used to be called, or the power of the mind to shape reality, that's the core idea of the New Thought movement. They were the ones who came up with the so-called law of attraction, that positive thoughts attract positive outcomes, magnetically, you might say, and negative thoughts attract negative outcomes. This is similar in practice to the law of karma from Hinduism, and indeed some of the later New Thought texts actually use the word karma to express this idea. An example of Hindu influence on the New Thought movement is William Walker Atkinson. He was a leader in this movement, but he published many books on yoga under a pseudonym, a fake name, Yogi Ramacharaka. You can see a picture of one of these books here on Raja Yoga, or the Royal Yoga. And so he never actually learned yoga under an Indian or Hindu master. He had read about it and basically added some Hindu beliefs and practices with his own ideas in these books. They were very influential, though, on how many people in the West viewed yoga and these Hindu ideas, because they were some of the first books to popularize yoga, at least in the West. There was a famous American psychologist, William James, who wrote about the New Thought movement, and including in his book, Varieties of Religious Experience, which is essentially the first book on the psychology of religion. But he also gives many examples from Indian mystics, as well as mystics of world religions in general. So this was another important avenue in which some types of Hindu beliefs or spirituality could be spread, knowledge of them could be spread to the West. So the Indian figures Ramakrishna and Vivekananda became very influential on Western perceptions of Hinduism, but also among the first few converts to Hinduism among Westerners. Ramakrishna never traveled to the West. He was an Indian mystic or saint, and he became very famous. He was an ascetic, so he practiced renunciation like a sannyasin, but he combined this with several other types of Hindu practice. So he was a devotee of Kali, so he practiced bhakti or devotional Hinduism. He also practiced Tantra and Advaita Vedanta. So it was not that common to combine all of these teachings, but he really emphasized the idea of many paths to God. There are many different spiritual paths, including potentially those of other religions than Hinduism, that can lead to God. And this is one of the reasons for the popularity of his teachings, especially in the West. Ramakrishna had a very famous student or disciple named Vivekananda. And Vivekananda traveled to Chicago in the United States in 1893 as part of the Parliament of World Religions. So this was a gathering of representatives from religions from around the world. And it was a very important event for a spread of the knowledge of Hinduism, and in particular of Advaita Vedanta, to the West. Many Westerners today regard Hinduism as having an essentially monistic view, that all is one, all is part of God. That's specifically the Advaita Vedanta school, and not all Hindus believe that. So an example of the influence, though, of Vivekananda is he founded the Vedanta Society in New York in 1894, and there was also a chapter of it founded in Los Angeles thereafter. And those became real important centers for spreading knowledge of Vedanta and Hinduism in general to the West. And eventually some students at these places became essentially converts to Hinduism. Another very important Indian figure who had an influence on religion was Mahatma Gandhi. So Gandhi was originally a British educated attorney who worked in South Africa. He studied in Britain to learn the British law, which was used in South Africa, which was a former British colony. When he lived and worked in South Africa, he began to lead a political movement or political activism, advocating for the rights of Indians in South Africa, who he felt were being discriminated against by the government there. He later moved to India to join the Indian independence movement against Britain. However, he advocated non-violent resistance to the British Raj, or British rule, in India. So this non-violent resistance was very uncompromising, but it may have been very effective in causing the British to eventually relinquish their control of India. For one thing, if you're being very strictly nonviolent, it gives you a kind of undeniable moral high ground, which can actually be very powerful in attracting support for your advocacy, both in this case, both among Indians and among people in Britain. So Gandhi had many influences on this philosophy. And it's interesting because the first influences were not Indian or Hindu. So he read Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. Thoreau, the Transcendentalist, had also written a book on nonviolent protest against the government. In Thoreau's case, he refused to pay taxes to the US government, because he opposed the United States' invasion of Mexico during the Mexican-American War. He didn't want his tax money going to support that cause, and he was imprisoned for his trouble. But he wrote this book as a kind of response and talking about the power of nonviolent resistance or non-cooperation with the government in order to try to effect change. Gandhi was also influenced by the Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, who later in life converted to or reconverted to Christianity, became a sincere, pious Christian, and he interpreted Christianity as advocating pacifism because, at least in part, of Jesus' teaching of turning the other cheek. So he thought that violent resistance was wrong, and he thought that you could have sort of radical political advocacy. He advocated for reforms of the then government of Russia, which was ruled by a czar and was kind of an empire. But he advocated for non-violent resistance or activism. So these had a big influence on Gandhi, and in particular, Tolstoy's religious influence. So he cited his Christian ethics as the reason for why you should be a pacifist, but also why you should not cooperate with imperialist or authoritarian governments. And then in middle age, Gandhi started to study Hinduism, go back to his Hindu roots. So he read the Bhagavad Gita and was greatly influenced by it. He was greatly influenced by the Hindu belief in ahimsa or nonviolence against all beings. And he used this to inform his political activism. And he took from the Bhagavad Gita the notion that karma yoga, or the yoga of action, could be both a way for promoting justice in the world, but also a religious path to salvation. So this was kind of a novel take, a new take on the karma yoga. It's not just, doing your duty as a kshatriya or performing rituals as a Brahmin. For Gandhi, karma yoga could include political activism or other types of activity in the modern world. And if you approach it with an attitude of self-sacrifice, not only is it more likely to be effective, but it can even be a spiritual and religious path for you. So this was Gandhi's kind of modernized take on Hinduism. He also criticized some aspects of traditional Hinduism, such as Chandala Varna, or the untouchable caste. He thought that the idea of an untouchable caste was immoral and should be removed from Hinduism. He advocated better relations, especially between religions, especially Hindus and Muslims. And he was opposed to the partition or splitting of India upon gaining independence from Britain, which it did largely along religious lines. He was actually assassinated by a Hindu nationalist, in part because he was regarded as advocating too many concessions to the Muslims. And around the time he was assassinated in 1948, this was shortly after Indian independence, and there were still a lot of tensions between Hindus and Muslims in South Asia. He later, in turn, influenced other civil rights activists, such as Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States, who also took inspiration from his religion, Christianity, to fuel his activism. But in particular, the idea of nonviolent resistance of Gandhi influenced King. So India gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1947. This was 2 years after the end of the Second World War. With independence, British India was partitioned or divided into two nations, Pakistan and India. And Pakistan was majority Muslim and India was majority Hindu. Basically, during the independence movement, there were some Muslim leaders who decided they did not want to be part of a majority Hindu nation that was independent from Britain because they were afraid that they would be discriminated against by the Hindu majority. So they advocated for Britain to give them their own nation, which became Pakistan. Pakistan was originally separated into two parts, West Pakistan and East Pakistan, because that's where the two largest concentrations of Muslims were. West Pakistan basically follows the course of the Indus River in the west, and East Pakistan was around the mouth of the Ganges River in the Bay of Bengal. Eventually, East Pakistan became an independent nation of Bangladesh in 1971. Before this time, Hindus and Muslims were mixed together in cities all across South Asia. After the split between Pakistan and India, there were a lot of refugees, Muslim refugees who moved from the new nation of India to Pakistan, and Hindu refugees who moved from Pakistan to India. There was a lot of violence, outbreaks of violence and rioting during this time in the cities and also among the columns of refugees who were moving. This was something new. There hadn't been this much sustained strife or violence between Hindus and Muslims, at least not since the original introduction of Islam in India hundreds of years before. Another bone of contention politically was the province of Kashmir in northern India. It was majority Muslim, but it was claimed by India, basically because its ruler had elected to join India instead of Pakistan. And India still occupies most of Kashmir today, but there's a lot of strife between the Muslim population there and the Indian government because most Kashmiris don't want to be part of India. Another example of the tensions between Hindus and Muslims, which persist in India to this day, is the Babri Mosque in Ayodhya. This was a mosque that's been built by the Mughals, and Hindus believe that Ayodhya was the city of Rama, the incarnation of Vishnu. So a Hindu mob gathered around the mosque in 1992 and tore it down. And eventually they built a Hindu temple in its place. But there was violence between Hindus and Muslims around this time. In 2002, there was an incident called the Godhra train burning, in which a train taking Hindus back from a pilgrimage to Ayodhya caught on fire. And many Hindus blamed Muslims, although I don't believe there's evidence that the fire was actually set deliberately. So they attacked, and there was mutual violence between Hindus and Muslims during this time. And there have been additional outbreaks of violence since 2002, unfortunately. So it shows you how religion can often be used as a marker of identity. And when there's conflicts between different groups, religion can be one factor that draws the lines and can be used to motivate the conflict. Hinduism is the majority religion of India, with about 80% of the population being Hindu. The next largest religion is Islam, which makes up about 14% of the population. You can see in the maps on the right that Islam is mostly concentrated in the state of Kashmir in the north. And there's also significant minorities of Muslims in other states in India, in both the north and the south. Christianity is the third most prominent religion. You can see the Christians are clustered in the far south of India, in states such as Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. The South Indian Christians tend to be either Oriental Orthodox or Catholic. The Oriental Orthodox Church in India spread there to ancient times. The Christians in the northeast of India, in the Himalayan mountains and near the border with Burma and Bangladesh, these are mainly Protestants who were converted by the British in the 1800s. So they're Presbyterians, Methodists, and Protestant denominations. There are also a small number of Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains. Sikhs are concentrated in the state of Punjab in North India, as you can see on the map. Hindu nationalism is seeing Hindutva or Hinduness as part of Indian national identity. This emerged as part of the Indian independence movement in the 1900s. The most prominent Hindu nationalist organization is the RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. They advocate Hindu renewal and oppose secularism. They want India's political culture to be Hindu, at least in part. They've been accused of discrimination against Muslims and Christians. They operate a large network of over 12,000 schools where they teach their values to young people. The RSS has a political party affiliated with it called the BJP, or Bharatiya Janata Party. The current Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, is of the BJP. Hindu nationalism has really grown in influence in the last couple of decades, especially under the leadership of Narendra Modi. You can see the members of RSS on the right in a military-style drill, And the flags that they're using have the Om symbol, which is often used as a symbol of Hinduism. Let's also talk about some of the Hindu organizations and Hindu influence organizations that emerged in the 20th century, especially after the Second World War, and the ones in particular that were influential in the West. One of these is Transcendental Meditation, or TM. This is actually not a religion or a sect. It's organized as a business. It was set up by a former engineer named Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who you can see in the picture on the right. He learned meditation, and he got the idea, Hindu meditation, and he got the idea of teaching it to Westerners and kind of selling it as a self-help tool or technique. So although it does have genuinely religious beliefs rooted in Hinduism, so they teach one divine mind or consciousness, like the Hindu belief in Atman or Brahman. So he teaches a mantra meditation where if you pay them a fee, you can be given a specific mantra based on your personal factors. And he also, this system of meditation is trademarked, and he has trademarked the name Transcendental Meditation. This had a big influence on the West, beginning with the 1960s counterculture. The counterculture of the 1960s emerged among several things: the civil rights movement, Vietnam War protest movement in the United States, but also just among many young people who wanted to greatly reform and change Western society. They were opposed to things like traditional approaches to Christianity, traditional gender roles, the patriarchy. They advocated environmentalism. They were opposed to excessive industrialization or pollution. So it was a variety of different things, but the main thing the counterculture had in common was protesting against the status quo and trying to reform society on progressive lines. And members of the counterculture movement were often attracted to non-Western religions. Many of them thought of Christianity or Judaism as being very patriarchal and as conflicting with feminism or other values. So many of them also believed in things like free love. So they were rejecting the values of a lot of traditional Western culture. And some of them were attracted to non-Western religions, including various forms of Hinduism and Buddhism. So Transcendental Meditation gained many followers among the counterculture. One example of the influence was when the famous band The Beatles and the actress Mia Farrow visited Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's ashram in the 1960s. They didn't end up becoming his followers. They observed some behavior they regarded as unethical. However, this is just an example of how bands and cultural influencers like the Beatles help spread different aspects of the counterculture and help popularize meditation. So for example, George Harrison, who was one of the Beatles, became a very famous meditator, and he also wrote a song that kind of combines a Hindu bhajan or devotional song with a Christian gospel or devotional song. So there was a lot of Hindu influence on just the broader counterculture during this time. Another example of a Hindu organization that had a big influence on the West is ISKCON, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. They are popularly known as Hare Krishnas because they frequently chant Hail Krishna or Hare Krishna as one of their expressions of piety. This organization was founded by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada in 1966. So it's a type of Vaishnava Hinduism called Gaudiya Vaishnava. This practices devotion to Krishna as the incarnation of Vishnu and says that's the way to moksha or liberation. Gaudiya Vaishnava is influenced by the earlier Hindu teacher Chaitanya, who had taught that the best way to express your devotion is with joyous song and dance. And you should be filled with this kind of joy and almost intoxicated with the love of God. What sets ISKCON apart is that they were a missionary movement seeking out converts, not only from other Hindus, but from Westerners. And so they were one of the main types of Hinduism that spread in the West, at least initially. They were also a great influence on the 1960s counterculture. Many modern Hindus follow not only a god or a sect, but a living guru, someone who's regarded as a teacher who can be a kind of intermediary between them and God or Brahman. So many living gurus are regarded as having attained moksha or some sort of exalted spiritual status. They've united with God. They even can be regarded as the living face or a manifestation of God. So the importance of gurus is still very strong in modern Hinduism. An example of a modern guru is Mata Amritananda Damayi, or Amachi, who's popularly known as the hugging guru, because her main practice is to hug followers lovingly as a kind of sign of the love of God and an expression and furtherance of that love. Some modern gurus face accusations of fraud, sexual abuse, or other crimes. Of course, you see this in all religions, but perhaps Hinduism, this is especially noticeable because of the concept of the guru as someone you place complete confidence and faith in. And that can be regarded as a very important type of bhakti or devotional Hinduism. We've talked in previous videos about modern yoga and how it resembles and differs from traditional yoga. Westerners started to become interested in yoga in the 19th century. An early example is N.C. Paul, who wrote a book called A Treatise on Yoga Philosophy, published in 1851. This book emphasized the meditative and self-development aspects of yoga, treating it as a sort of mystical philosophy. Later in the 19th century, modern yoga was developed in India. This is a type of hatha yoga that focuses not only on meditation and breathing, but primarily on the asanas or postures. It was actually greatly influenced by Western calisthenics, which is a type of gymnastic exercise. The people who developed modern yoga combined certain concepts from Western calisthenics, which were then popular in the 19th century, with the traditions of yoga. So they do practice meditation and breath control, for example, and some of the asanas they use do date back to ancient India. However, many of the modern postures that you would learn in a yoga class, such as the downward dog, were developed in the 19th century. An important figure in spreading modern yoga to the West was Vivekananda, the follower of Ramakrishna, who taught yoga in Western countries such as the United States in the 1890s. The Theosophists were also influential in spreading the practice of yoga. Even in the early 20th century, Theosophy centers often had yoga classes for people. So their members were sort of ahead of the curve on that one. Modern yoga, unlike traditional yoga, is also not necessarily religious. There are some practitioners of modern yoga who regard it as a religious or a spiritual practice, but it can also be treated just as a purely physical or wellness exercise. So it really varies. Now, even though modern yoga does indeed have its roots in Hinduism, especially given the focus on the asanas in modern yoga, it doesn't have to be a really religious or spiritual thing. It can just be a type of gymnastic exercise. So it really varies based on the intention of who's practicing it. And that's unlike traditional yoga, which was really geared towards spiritual liberation or moksha and union with God as the main goal. Another interesting fact about modern yoga is that, especially in the West, it's primarily popular among women. Of course, there are both men and women who follow it, but the majority of followers seem to be women. And this is the reverse of traditional yoga, which was mainly practiced by men and renunciates, sannyasins, in India. There were female yoginis and renunciates as well, but they were much rarer. So let's talk a bit about modern Hindu customs surrounding marriage and family. So in modern Hindu society, there is great pressure among men and women to marry. It's basically the expectation for everyone, unless you want to become a sannyasin or renunciate. There's a whole class of professional matchmakers who help Hindus find prospective marriage partners. And it's still the custom to marry within the same jati or caste. In Hinduism, the custom is for the wife to live with their husband's family. So this is called patrilocal by scholars because it's local to or near the father or pater. The bride's family must give a dowry to the groom's family in Hinduism. A dowry can be a large amount of money. The original idea behind the dowry seems to be that because a woman is going to live with the family of her husband, they're going to take care of her and provide for her. So her family would traditionally give some resources to make this easier. It's the reverse of a bride price. Bride prices are paid by the family of the husband to the family of the wife, whereas dowries are paid by the family of the wife to the family of the husband. This practice of the dowry is sometimes very burdensome, and it's one reason why some Hindus actually prefer to have male children rather than female. In addition to the fact that Hinduism, like most other religions, has patriarchal values in it, at least in its history, the practice of the dowry means that if you give birth to a girl, you know you're eventually going to lose her labor from the household, and you're going to have to pay a dowry to the family of her husband. Whereas if you give birth to a boy, then the reverse is true. So this can create a kind of economic incentive for families to prefer male children over female. Abortion and birth control are opposed by many or most traditional Hindus. There has been increased acceptance in recent decades to artificial insemination and other forms of modern family planning. However, some Hindus are reported to selectively abort female fetuses, which has led to a small but perhaps socially significant disparity in the sexes of children born in India. The picture on the right is from a Hindu wedding in Nepal. Nepal is a nation to the north of India, and it's majority Hindu. It's in the Himalayan mountains. You can see the groom placing sindoor, the colored pigment, on the forehead of his bride. And this is to reflect the fact that her status has changed, because the sindoor is only worn there by married women. And finally, let's talk briefly about the Hindu diaspora. The word diaspora literally means dispersal. It refers to the dispersal of an ethnic or religious group from their native land or homeland. The term was first used to refer to the dispersal of the Jews from Judea or Palestine after their second revolt against Rome was crushed in 79 CE. And the Jews had already existed in a partial diaspora before then, but after that, they really spread throughout the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Well, similarly, in modern times, there's been a Hindu diaspora. This had two main phases. The first phase started in the 19th century under the British Raj. So it was fairly common for Indians, both Hindu and Muslim, to migrate to other British colonies. Sometimes this was encouraged by the British because they had these Hindus or Muslims do certain jobs for them in their other colonies. Examples include populations of Hindus in Guyana, Jamaica, Malaysia, and South Africa, all of which were historically English colonies at one time. And then the second phase or wave of the Hindu diaspora occurred after independence from Britain. So this is when you see migration of people from both India and Pakistan to countries such as the UK, Canada, Australia, and the US. And this was done largely for the sake of career and to give better economic opportunities for the families. But it's one way that Hinduism has spread throughout the world. An interesting note is the sometimes different character of Hindu temples in the diaspora as opposed to in India. In the diaspora, temples can often double as community centers because they're places for Hindus to kind of meet each other and network and to provide mutual support. Additionally, it's common to have multiple sects of Hinduism sharing the same temple, which isn't generally done in India. The reason for this is just in terms of logistics, because in various cities in North America or in the UK or Australia or wherever, usually there's only a relatively small population of Hindus. So if they tried to organize separate temples by sect, there might only be a few families of each particular sect, and so there wouldn't be enough to financially support a temple. So Hindus of different sects and traditions will often gather their resources and make one temple where all of their rituals can be performed. And so you can get Brahmins, for example, of different sects, Vaishnavas and Shaivas and others, all working in the same temple in the diaspora.